Hello, welcome. My name is Charlotte. I love colorful and sparkly makeup, but I don't love capitalism and I don't love consumerism, so that's the point of view from which I approach makeup here on my channel. If that sounds like something you're interested in, then go ahead and subscribe, and stick around for more videos. But today I'm going to be duping this extremely expensive palette that I purchased recently. This is the Byredo Mineralscapes palette, if you don't recognize this. It was extremely viral. The Byredo limited edition palettes always are, and I've always coveted them when they come around. Well, I was only really paying attention to Byredo as a brand, starting with their Remembrance palette, which was also a gorgeous color story, much, much warmer than this, and honestly, probably something that would be easier for me to wear. But I did miss out on that palette. That was not a time when I would have ever considered spending more than $100 on an eyeshadow palette. But now, I do sometimes buy expensive makeup, and I splurged on this palette. I think this color story is a dream. It is so beautiful, so nice to look at. All of the marketing around the Swedish fjords, the coastal forest, all of those that nature imagery that was surrounding this palette is just stunning. I think they did a really good job capturing the vibe of those images in this color story. And I knew that these palettes don't stick around for long. They come out only once a year, and people rave about the formula. They say it's just like a very luxurious, elegant formula. So I went ahead and bought this on launch as soon as I saw it available. I did not wait around for swatches or reviews or anything like that. And I was certain that I would love this palette. And in a sense, I don't regret that, mainly because I know that I can resell this. That was another thing at the back of my mind, because they're limited edition palettes, they do have a resale value after the palette's discontinued. But after I ordered the palette, I watched a bunch of people doing looks with it online before my palette arrived. I can link a few videos below, but I saw beautiful looks from Fox Waffles Does Makeup here on YouTube, I Am Jamila on YouTube. The palette looked stunning on them. I was really excited. And when I started to put this on my eyes, I just felt like the colors didn't show up on me the way that they showed up on people I saw online. And I felt that they didn't really show up true to pan either. And I think it just has something to do with these desaturated tones that have a lot of gray in them, and the way that they interact with my complexion. I think they just tend to make me look a little bit sick, and the shades lose all their nuance. So the first look I made with this, I paired some of these blues and purples, and I just kind of felt like they turned into one tone on my eyes. It looked like I was just wearing gray all across my lid. You couldn't see where the blue became the purple. I did actually get a compliment on my makeup that night, funnily enough. Somebody was like, "Oh, I'm always too nervous to wear bold makeup." That was the compliment. And it's funny because I wear bold makeup out quite regularly. I don't usually get comments on it. It was very nice to get a compliment, but I think it does kind of go to show that I was wearing neutral, this is a pretty neutral palette. I was wearing somewhat neutral colors on my eyes, but the fact that they looked so bold and noticeable on me that somebody would comment on them, I think just goes to show that these colors are really disharmonious with my complexion. And it's starting to make me realize how much I gravitate toward more saturated tones for myself. I think those are the ones I'm most comfortable wearing, and the ones that I feel flatter me most and make sort of my skin look nicer and all of those things. That's not to say I don't love these tones. I do. In isolation, I think this is gorgeous, and I think these individual colors are very interesting in and of themselves. I like the gray-based colors. I like the nuances. I like them on other people. I just never like the looks that I get out of this palette on myself. So all of that is to say, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to resell this palette. I haven't decided for absolute certain. I'm going to be swatching it during this video, but I'm trying to like keep that to a minimum and, you know, keep it in good condition. I want to try and dupe this in my collection. I think a lot of these tones, I won't necessarily have something close to them. That's part of why I ordered this palette as well, was because, you know, I don't have a ton of like denim blues, for example, these like this warm purple shimmer. Some of this stuff is pretty unique in my collection. It's possible that I have versions of these colors in my collection that will work better for me. That I can create a version of this color story with shades I like and that I know I will wear. And maybe that also will help me make a final decision about whether I want to declutter this palette. Interestingly, I do think that the color story reminds me a little bit of the Flower Beauty Jungle Lights palette, minus all the blues. And this palette doesn't feel gray to me at all. There's a little bit of gray in this green tone, but overall this feels more like a kind of warm autumnal color story to me. And I love this color story. I find this so inspiring. I don't use these shades in conjunction with each other all that often because they have a thick texture, so I should play around with that more, because looking at them all together, I am inspired by this color story, and looking at it side by side with this palette, I think it actually does capture some of what interests me with this palette. Again, minus those more foggy colors, which I think are really beautiful in this color story. Also, of course, the formulas that I'm going for are going to be a little bit more sparkly and impactful than these ones. These are very soft. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a really nice formula. But for me, it's like, it's no great loss to turn a satin into a sparkle shade. I don't mind. I was interested in trying this formula. It's okay. It's nice. I don't think it's like the best, most elegant formula I've ever tried, even compared with things that aren't as fancy as this. But it's a nice formula, and like, I don't fault it for not being sparkly. That's not one of my complaints about the palette at all. So funnily enough, we're starting out with this top shade, which is the denim blue. And I have pretty much always reached for this when I create a look with this palette. I'm really drawn to denim blues, like in isolation. I just don't wear them a ton, so I don't have a lot in my collection. That's one that might actually be difficult for me to dupe. But let's see what we have in this blue palette. So there, you can see how smooth that formula is, and they are a bit dry too. I know that's not always a bad thing, but they don't feel super nice to swatch, I will say. So right off the bat, the shades I think of are these kinds of teal shades I have. So this is called Feels Like, and it's from the ColourPop It's a Mood palette. It's much, much greener and warmer, and it has a bit of a gold sparkle. So that's not super close. Okay, I have to give you the usual disclaimer that my eyeshadows are never organized. So I'm like looking for a specific shadow. The shade I'm looking for, I actually store in my green palette, which is probably telling me it's not gonna be a good fit. This is Frost from the Beauty Bay Earthy palette, and you can see it is much more green. But honestly, it kind of fits the vibe of this palette, I feel like. And I don't know, I love that color. I love wearing that color, so it might be like the version of that color that I would put in the palette. And then I always think of that one in conjunction with this shade Nightfall from Looxi. Oh, okay, I always think of these as really similar, but now I see that Nightfall is bluer. It's so much more impactful than that denim blue in the Byredo palette. It's got like a gold and green kind of shiftiness to it. I think the undertone is blue, similar to that one. It might be the closest I have. One other one I want to try is Splash from Looxi. This is more of a topper shade. I don't think it has a ton of blue. It's more like, yeah, it's more like that green gold finish that Nightfall has, but without so much of the blue base. So that's actually not what I want. Now, if I really want to go for a gray vibe, I have this shade called Steel from the Beauty Bay Midnight palette. I might use this for one of those purple shades. Honestly, I think Steel is the closest, but I think I'm gonna use Steel later on. So I'm gonna set that aside and I'm gonna pull out Nightfall. That is going to be my very, very loose dupe for this one. I think the others will get a little closer. But moving along, we have this green shade, and you can already see these greens. I would sit down to use this palette and I would look at the colors and I'd be like, what is the difference between these two? And it would make me not know which one to use. So I'm gonna work on these together because look, they're so close. This one's a little bit more, well, a little bit lighter, a little bit more gold in the sheen, I would say. This one's more green with a darker base. They're both, again, like pretty gray. And I'm not gonna pull out this shade, obviously, because these are not depotted, but this is the shade that immediately this made me think of. I think it's the closest I have in my collection. Look, they're almost exact dupes, actually. If you have the Jungle Lights and you've been coveting the Mineralscapes, pull it out. Those are so close. So close. Wow. And I love this shade in the Jungle Lights. I think it's a nicer, like it's got a nicer finish than the Byredo one. Okay, moving on though. I have tons of these kinds of olive greens. So I can already tell that the closest thing in my collection to this lighter olive is gonna be this shade from Lisa Eldridge called Madrigal. This is a pretty shade in theory. You can see, oh my God, it's so close. It's so close. Is this focusing? Ah, okay. So similar. This is really nice in isolation, but I do tend to steer away from this shade because it has a very gray base. So because I'm trying to make this a version of the palette that I will reach for and feel like is flattering on me, I'm gonna actually stay away from this color and I'm going to instead use a more saturated version. Like here, you can see this is a lot more vibrant. This is Gabriel from the Odin's Eye Tingles collection. Ah, why does this keep going out of focus? Okay, so that's Gabriel. I love that shade. This is from the Glamlite Dirty Martini palette. High class. Very close to Gabriel, but a little bit more shiny, dimensional. I have Folklore from the Beauty Bay. That is pretty close to this light shade. I don't use that shade enough. I have been meaning to pull that out. I also have this shade Crisp. No. Is this Crisp? Yes, I think this is Crisp from the Dirty Martini palette. You can tell I fucking love myself an olive green. Love that. These are all gorgeous. I have this is more of like a forest green, but just for the hell of it, let's swatch this. Dragon Slayer from Looxi, RIP. This, I don't know, this might be my favorite eyeshadow. Like I don't use it all the time, but this might be like the coolest eyeshadow in my collection. I think it's too impactful for what I'm trying to create here. This is a BYOP I recently built. Hopefully it's up on my channel by the time you see this. Another one from Dirty Martini. This one's called Olive Lover, and that's like a pretty, you know, true olive, I guess. A lot of good options here. I'm so sorry about the focus. I don't know why, it just really likes to focus on the pans. They're pretty, but they're not the point. Okay. I really like Folklore and High Class. I think those are the ones I'm leaning toward. Or Olive Lover, I like that too. I've got to start speeding this up, but I think I'm gonna pull them all three, and I'm just gonna narrow it down once I see everything together. All right, so this fourth shade is one of the more sparkly and impactful shades in the Byredo palette. It's a taupe, like a really nice taupe. This was also something that attracted me about the palette because I've sort of been like on the hunt for a shade that would dupe for me those like, you know, really viral shades from the I Need a Nude palette. I've been on the hunt for those for a while. And so I'm always these days attracted when I see that in a palette. I found my perfect version and it's better than this one. And it is from Glaminatrix. It's called Komodo. Okay, it's a bit more silver. You can see the bases are very similar, like they're a similar taupe color, but the Glaminatrix one has so much more sparkle and so much more shine. The shine is so much more prominent that it does come across looking quite silver. This next shade we're going to swatch is called Mineral. This is like a champagne, I guess. Really, like, I gotta say it's nothing special. It's just like an inner corner highlight, but it barely shows up and it's not that shiny. I don't really have a ton of champagnes. Okay, I don't know what I was thinking. I just watched a whole bunch of shades trying to find a champagne and failing. I had forgotten to pull this bad boy out with my palettes. This is the Nearly Natural from Glaminatrix, and I have the perfect champagne. This is not a problem. A little bit pink leaning. It's not by any means an exact match for the undertones of this, but that's fine. Okay, now we have a couple of like yellowish gold shades side by side. Again, they're pretty close. I think I look at the palette and I don't know which one to use. Okay, it's looking like I've never actually used or swatched this second one. Go figure. Yeah, like I look at those and I'm like, how would I choose between them? You know, it just feels hard to use in a way. And these, honestly, they look like those bad Looxi shades. I'm sorry. I feel like ultimately I'm being so mean about this palette. I said that I didn't have a problem with the formula, but these look and feel like those defective Looxi shades that we were getting. This one I think is like a little bit more yellow, and I think this one is a little bit more champagne. That is the difference I'm seeing. And I have a couple of go-to golds. So the first one I'm going to swatch is this one, Cava, from the Beauty Bay Earthy palette. So sparkly, so beautiful. Once again, Jungle Lights definitely has a good dupe for this. I will swatch it for you just in case you have this palette and are curious how close it is. Again, it's more shiny than the Byredo. I mean, I have such a hard time telling the difference between these, so it's very close to both of them. That's the shade Paradise from Jungle Lights. Beautiful. Okay, so the other gold I wanted to swatch is this one that we just saw from Nearly Natural. This is New Nude. And New Nude is actually one of the smoother shades in Nearly Natural, which has like a pretty high sparkle formula overall. So that actually is a really good dupe for these golds. Yeah, it's hard to tell, again, like which should be which, but I think this one is like a little bit darker, so I think I'm going to put that in for this one and put this in for this one. You probably can't even tell the difference. This next shade is sort of a ballet slipper pink. Well, maybe a little bit peachier and warmer actually than a ballet, what you'd call a ballet slipper, but it's very cute. This is a really pretty soft shade. Honestly, it's pretty similar to what I pulled for the champagne, but I think I still need to use that champagne as the champagne. I have more options in the pink category, so I'm going to look. First, let me just, while we have this guy handy, this is Nearly Natural from the Nearly Natural palette, and it's very similar vibes, very similar undertones, I would say. Nearly Natural is like pretty warm. You're not really catching the base there of the Byredo shade because it is quite sheer, to be fair. I think it's similar to Nearly Natural, even though Nearly Natural is darker. Also in this palette I have Unveiled, which is like a pretty peachy pink. That is actually really quite close. Okay. Oh, I like that. Okay, yeah, I'm very tempted to just go with Unveiled. There's a couple other things I wanted to swatch. I'm gonna do that and I'll be right back. you will probably not even see everything I've swatched because they're obviously very close to my skin tone. But again, here's Nearly Natural from Glaminatrix, Unveiled from Glaminatrix. This is from a Japanese brand called Vise. That's from a palette called like the Pink Brown palette. I think I depotted that. It's very pretty. They have a really nice, elegant formula. And that's really close. 2 ColourPop shades. Those ColourPop shades are like a little bit dry and not that shiny. Again, this isn't a super shiny formula from Byredo, but I would rather have something shiny. I think the ColourPop and Vise shades are the closest, but I'm leaning towards using Unveiled just because I think it's prettier. It's a very similar base, but it has a more prominent silver sparkle on top. Okay, I'm sorry. We're almost at the halfway point. I hope this isn't excruciating. I hope you're not watching my videos if you find them excruciating. You don't have to. This is a copper shade, and there's 2 coppers that I think of in my collection. Oh, maybe 3. So this is the Monarch from Looxi, one of their really beautiful like peak Looxi formulas. This is Fizz from the Beauty Bay Earthy palette. Definitely less dimensional than the Looxi shade, which kind of shifts like bright gold. But it's pretty close to the actual color and finish of the Byredo. And then another shade from Nearly Natural. I cannot believe I forgot to pull this out. Second Skin. This is really sparkly and it's become my go-to copper, although I don't wear this shade all that often. It's a little bit more orange. I think I'm gonna go with Fizz because it's a closer color dupe and I want to preserve the like neutralness of this color story. I think the Glaminatrix shade might just be a little bit too bright and orange. And then just for interest, in case you're following along, in case you are still interested in the Jungle Lights palette specifically and how it compares, this is the copperiest shade here. Obviously much brighter and more colorful. Okay, so we've reached the first matte in the palette. And the palette only has 2 mattes. They're very satiny. They're the kind of matte formula that I really like. This one is like that color that's described as a clay color. I love this kind of color. Like it's one of the only matte shades that I get actively excited about, weirdly, and I think this is a beautiful version of it. I think most versions of this clay pink are really warm. I think we'll see that in the ones I have. This one has like a taupiness to it, like that muted sort of grayness, even though it is a warm toned color. It's really, really nuanced, and I think this is a gorgeous version of this kind of shade. So I have a ton of options for shades in this kind of category. I decided to swatch them here on this paler part of my skin so that you can see the differences better. This is the Byredo shade. It's called Sun Dried. And honestly, this might be my favorite shade in the palette, which I feel like kind of silly about given that I clearly like dupe myself so often with this shade. But it is different. It is different from any of the others I have. So this is Labyrinth from ColourPop. This is Syrup from the Glamlite Chocolate Martini palette. This is the Libra from the ColourPop Zodiac palette. That is a very old shade in my collection, but it's still really beautiful. I really like that. This is Brick from the Beauty Bay Earthy palette. This is Cherubim from Lisa Eldridge. And this is Irish Cream from the Glamlite Chocolate Martini palette. And I just wanted, for curiosity's sake, I wanted to swatch this one. It's called it's called Bittersweet from the Glamlite Chocolate Martini palette, and it's just a rosy toned brown, so I wanted to see how that compared. You can see from this comparison that the Byredo shade has more brown in it than any of my other shades, and it's also a little bit more cool toned, but this is still, you can see, too brown, obviously. I'm a little bit torn. This Lisa Eldridge shade is definitely the closest in formula. It's a very elegant formula. So I might pull that out. I think this ColourPop shade gets at the vibe because it's the most mauve-y, I guess, which I feel like captures something about that taupiness. And then I also really like this shade because it's subtle. It's like gentle in the same way as that Byredo color. So I'm gonna just pull all three out for now. So this warm purple, this dusty kind of shade is another one that really drew me to the palette. Like, I feel like that already looks so much more gray on my hand than it does in the pan. But maybe it's just me being picky. In any case, I love this shade that's in the pan there. And I already have my perfect version of this shade, which is here. This is Wild from the Jungle Lights palette. It's such a beautiful warm purple. And it's like a warm purple brown. It's like a dusty purple. I think a lot of the time when people say warm purple, they end up talking about magenta kinds of like pink purples. I love that this is a warm brown purple. The only thing I don't like about this shade from the Jungle Lights palette is that it is that thicker formula. I find makes it a little bit hard to pair with other things. I think these shades can become like kind of overworked on your eye really quickly and then look chunky and heavy. So I tend to use them as one and dones, which is fine. Like, honestly, I like monochromatic looks, so I have it in my head that like I want a single shadow version of this shade, but really, like, why? So I don't have a single shadow version of this shade. I'm going to swatch a few things I consider to be like warm adjacent, purple adjacent shades. That's Tombak from Glam Shop. It's like what I would consider a cool purple base, but it has a warm golden shimmer on top. So I don't think it's that close to this shade Wild, but I think it's actually quite a bit closer to this shade in the Byredo palette. So that's definitely a strong contender. There's one more I wanted to swatch. This is Jelly from Looxi. It's a very different vibe. Okay, very different. It's more of that pink purple actually in the base. And obviously the blue is far too vibrant for this palette. It would really throw off the vibe. I'm really happy with the way Tombak looks. I'm gonna pull that one out. We have another purple here, and again, I don't think I've swatched or used this shade yet. It is a cool toned kind of indigo, is that what you would call that? I'm gonna swatch this actually, skipping ahead with this other cool toned purple shimmer. I don't have a lot of shades in this category, and so I'm gonna have to compare them and see which goes with which. I already mentioned I was setting aside this shade Steel from Beauty Bay, and I honestly don't know which one it goes with better. Somewhere in between them, I would say. Now let's see what I have in here, because I don't use my purples all that often, so I don't even really know what all is in here. Let me try Oxidized from Cleona. This is a very sparkly, shifty shade, but it does have like a gray base, so it could fit the vibe of this palette. Yeah, in a pinch I would use that. And then what's this one? This is from the Beauty Bay Midnight palette. Yeah, all the Midnight palette shades are a little bit too warm, I think. They have that like pink undertone. Yeah, it has a cool purple shimmer, but it's too vibrant. This is Twilight from Looxi. Yeah, like it has a muted gray base on it, but the shimmer is too bright blue. I really don't have a shade that feels perfect. It might have to be this, honestly. This is from the Glamlite GhostFace palette. I think it's called Sharpest Knife. You can see it has that pinky purple shimmer, that vibrancy that I didn't really want in the palette, but it does also have like a very gray quality because all the shades in that palette do. Oh, one thing I could do actually is just use a silver. Yeah, that silver is so sparkly. It is called Midnight Robe. It's from the GhostFace palette from Glamlite. Yeah, I think I could use just that and steel to stand in for these colors. I'm gonna swatch these deep blues together. I would say these two shades are very similar, but this one's a little more teal and this one's a little bit more of a royal blue, although it's still quite teal leaning, I would say. I have a couple of deep blues from the Beauty Bay Midnight palette. Hi. Yeah, so that's pretty close as like a royal blue, I would say. I also have this shade Swan Song from the Eldridge Sorcery palette. Also very close. More similar in formula to the Byredo. This is For a Night from ColourPop. Those are very close. That might be the closest thing I've swatched so far, actually. And then for this teal shade, this is Wit from the Beauty Bay Earthy palette. It's blacker and a little bit less green, I would say, than this teal shade. I love that shade Wit, so I'm leaning towards using that one, but let me swatch this first. This is from the Midnight palette again from Beauty Bay. Actually, I think this one is closer to the brighter royal blue. Okay, yeah, I think I'm gonna go with Wit and this ColourPop shade. This next shade is a very muted green. And again, you can see it looks so much grayer in the swatch than it does in the pan. And I feel like that is because of my skin tone, but I don't know. This reminded me right away of this shade from the Eldridge Sorcery palette, which actually, this is another one that I tend to stay away from because of the gray base. But this is called Mage. It's very similar. Interesting. Very similar. Okay, I'm leaning toward pulling that one out, but I did just want to compare it to this, what I think of as a sage green. This shade Cheerfulness from the Odin's Eye Stone and Rock palette. It has a bright shimmer to it, and it's obviously a completely different formula to these two smooth shades, but yeah, it's interesting because I don't think that this looks sagey next to these two, because when I think of a sage green, I think of like a green with gray in it, and just compared to those, this doesn't look like it has gray in it, even though on its own I do think of it as a sage. So I think I'm just gonna go with the Eldridge shade. Even though it's not my favorite shade, it's just so close, I just can't not. Here's the second matte in the palette, and this is like almost a lavender shade, like a gray purple. That is definitely a shade I stay away from. It's like not easy for me to pull that off. I'm tempted to like replace it with something else. I'm thinking maybe of like a warm dusty purple, because those are some of my favorite mattes to use. This is from the Making Mauves palette from ColourPop. Big Fig, I think? Yeah, Big Fig. I love that shade. Yeah, that's much more my speed. And it honestly, like, the transition shade is really important, right? I mean, obviously, like, it's what helps the rest blend into your skin. So I think it's important, it's more important that that match your undertone than anything else you're using. This is Chic Happens from ColourPop. That one, I think, captures the spirit of the gray a little bit better, so I'm actually leaning toward that one. And the final shade in the palette is another taupey champagne kind of color. Very smooth, very taupey. You know, I think the closest thing I have is actually in my ColourPop Bare Necessities palette. You can see this is completely beat up. I used to use this pretty much every day. And I still really like this palette in theory, like I think it's a good palette, but I just have, you know, nicer shades at this point. But I think these two taupey champagne shades could actually be really good. So this is Silk Teddy. And then this is Rumored. Okay, Rumored is really close. Yeah, and Rumored is it was my favorite shade from this palette. It's just so much less sparkly than the shades I like to use now. But it's very like pretty color. It's like a taupey pink kind of champagne. Really lovely. So this is my dupe of Mineralscapes. These are the shades I decided to go with as the final picks. I admit I was still torn on the greens, and I decided to go with Folklore and Olive Lover. So the one I kicked out was this more vibrant green. I think that's just an interesting question because I think this is sort of like the heart of my hesitations with this palette is I do think this is more the type of green I think looks best on me, but these are truer to the Mineralscapes palette, so I went with the ones that are closer. I don't know, I'm interested to know how I get along with the dupe version of this, given that these are shades that I wear and that I like and that I don't find too gray on myself. I'm curious if any of you picked up this palette, what your experience has been. Did you dupe it out? Is it just way too expensive for you? That's totally reasonable. But this was really a fun duping exercise for myself. I'm super excited to play around with this palette. I'm definitely leaning towards getting rid of this because every time I swatched things next to the real palette, I preferred my shades. That's the video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again in a future video. Bye.